This episode of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast is brought to you by Legacy Staffs, which are crafted by the Brazos Walking Stick Company in Waco, Texas. You can go to brazosticks.com and use the name Mac Payne, one word, at the checkout and get 10% off your next order of the Legacy Staff or cane of your own design.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1825 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to share a story with you about a Vietnam veteran who began his career as a draft dodger. But don't worry, it worked out quite well. The Vietnam veteran I'm going to tell you about in this podcast episode is none other than Dr. Earl Tilford, U.S. Air Force. He served in the Air Force for 21 years, went through the Air Force ROTC program, became an Air Force intelligence officer, and then went on to earn a Ph.D. Today he resides in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, home of the Crimson Tide. That is, if they ever come home. They've been scared off by the COVID-19. It's going to be nice when all this is over with. The reasons for me sharing this story about Dr. Tilford are too numerous to mention. The primary one is that his story totally verifies my often repeated assertion on this podcast. The Vietnam veteran generation is as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from its country. Dr. Tilford proves that with his lifetime of service to his country. Dr. Earl Tilford is almost too cool for school when you look at his background. Number one, he is a Vietnam veteran. Did quite well over there. Number two, the way he met his wife could be made into a movie. Number three, he was involved in Operation Lam Son 719. Another point in his favor is that he lives with a high degree of certainty as to what is going to happen to him when he draws his last breath. That's right, he is a Christian who was smart enough to accept the free-of-charge gift offered to you on a silver platter, and that is eternal salvation. The cost is almost nothing compared to what you receive for it. Dr. Tilford's a smart guy, and he is aware of that. I'm going to share a story with you about Dr. Tilford that appeared in the Citizen newspaper in Fayetteville, Georgia. Something that was not made clear in this story was Fayetteville, Georgia is just about 20 miles south of Atlanta. Dr. Tilford lives over in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is maybe 100 miles or so west of Birmingham, Alabama. But that doesn't really matter. What's important here is the message in this story. Something shocking is going to be divulged in this story that may surprise you. The title of the story I'm going to share with you is Confessions of a Draft Dodger. It's in the form of an opinion piece in The Citizen. Maybe Dr. Tilford knows the people over at the Citizen newspaper in Fayetteville, Georgia. That could be it. That really doesn't matter. The important thing here is the message from Dr. Tilford's story. First, before I get into his opinion piece, let me give you a little bit of his background. Dr. Earl Tilford is a military historian and fellow for the Middle East and Terrorism with the Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City, Pennsylvania College. He currently lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, home of the Crimson Tide. He is a retired Air Force intelligence officer. Dr. Tilford earned his Ph.D. in American and European military history at George Washington University. From 1993 to 2001, he served as Director of Research at the U.S. Army Strategic Studies Institute. He finished up his work there, and in 2001, he left government service for a professorship at Grove City College, where he taught courses in military history, national security, and international and domestic terrorism and counter-terrorism. So you can see Dr. Earl Tilford is no lightweight. I cannot wait until we get to the part in his opinion piece where he talks about Lam Son 719. I had the privilege of participating in that operation as a Cobra gunship pilot with A Battery, 4th of the 77th Field Artillery. Our battery was chosen to relocate out to the badlands of Quezon. We stayed out there for 6 weeks. To a Cobra gunship rocket shooter, it was the experience of a lifetime. Dr. Tilford's going to be talking about some of the higher level things about the operation. I was on the other end of what he's talking about. I was just a rocket shooter out there trying to make a difference. It was very exciting for all of us in A Battery because back in our home base at Fubai, we would be busy sometimes, and then there would be other times where we would have a day or so off. It would get a little boring. Some of the guys would lay around and relax or drink beer all night. And I would spend that valuable time dragging my flight platoon out to the battery free fire area and practice shooting rockets. Shooting rockets from a helicopter can be an extremely frustrating experience if you don't know how to do it. That's easier said than done because firing folding fin aerial rockets from an unstable platform like a helicopter is highly difficult, but the day you learn how to shoot those rockets the same way a concert pianist can play the piano and make them go exactly where and how you want them to go, your whole life changes. When we went out to Quezon, I had recently learned how to shoot rockets and make them go where I wanted them to go, and it was a rocket shooter's paradise out there. Back in Fubai, we may have a day or so off. Out at Quezon, we started working the moment we arrived on station and never stopped. All day long, every day. It was a rocket shooter's paradise. I'll have to admit, the Arvins got roughed up a little bit out there. The NVA also totally emptied out the entire Army inventory of C-model gunships. They were just too slow to put up with that high-intense environment. Also, sadly, had to watch helicopters blow up in air or crash in the ground and explode, knowing that it was full of Americans who did not survive. That was tough, but overall, it was an exciting experience. Also had the opportunity to meet none other than Jed Duvall. He was Walter Cronkite's right-hand man. We had a very nice conversation. Enough about my experiences at Lam Son 719. Let's get into Dr. Tilford's opinion piece. To all the women listeners out there, you're going to love the story about how he and his wife were married over in Thailand. Let's take a look at it. Confessions of a Draft Dodger by Dr. Earl Tilford. Dateline, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Next month, I turn 75. The ubiquitous they tell me I'm on a COVID-19 endangered species list. That's another connection to that story. I'm about the same age, and they tell me the same thing. I have to be very careful. I have to wear a mask all the time. I can't go out to a restaurant or anything because I'm a member of the endangered species. An older person. Thank goodness I don't have any underlying medical conditions, but I'm still on the list. Dr. Tilford continues, 50 years from October, with my 25th birthday behind me, I boarded a plane in Miami and headed for the other side of the world. I really was not in much danger, and I had volunteered specifically for a tour at Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand. On my volunteer form, I wrote it was because of my lifelong fascination with Northern Thai history. You can tell just from that he's a sharp dude. Continuing. Now here's the real story. In truth, I was following a second lieutenant I met the first day of training at the Air Force Air Intelligence Officers Training School. She had gone to UDORN in July. We married on October the 20th, 1970 in a Thai civil ceremony. Mission accomplished. Can you imagine that? He was able to convince the Air Force to send him over to UDORN, Thailand, so he could meet up with his true love. What a story. That would make a good Netflix movie. Continuing. Here is the draft dodger portion of his story. In 1966, as a college sophomore, I signed up for Advanced Air Force ROTC because it carried a draft exemption. Prior to my entree into higher education, I had crammed my first 12 years of schooling into 13. So I was, at 21, too old to be a college sophomore. I was, however, draft bait. I made a deal of giving 6 years to the Air Force, counting 2 as a cadet while still in college, in exchange for not having to worry about being drafted. I know just how he feels. That's one of the reasons I was in the Army ROTC at the University of Florida. I did not want to receive a tap on the shoulder from the local draft board. Continuing. In retrospect, I learned a lot from the 21 years I spent in uniform. While my volunteering for service at UDORN was a gambit of the heart, as fate had it, my assignment was to Headquarters 7 of the 13th Air Force. Whatever that is. I never could figure out Air Force unit designations. Of course, I was in the Army. He continued. That was a small detachment run by a major general. It focused on the top-secret air war in Laos, especially northern Laos. Accordingly, I pulled myself out of bed at 11:30 every night, bid farewell to my wife, and wandered a few hundred feet from our air-conditioned quarters to the intel shop. There, I organized, wrote, and then at 0800 hours the next morning, presented a briefing to the commanding general. Here he tells about a stark realization that hit him in the face about what goes on at the higher up levels of the military. He said this, "My epiphany occurred in March of 1971 when I was briefing our general and a visiting Air Force lieutenant general on the aforementioned Operation Lam Son 719, an ill-fated South Vietnamese Army invasion of Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A personal note here, I saw a lot of interesting things going out there on the road to Saipan, Laos." Continuing. The morning I gave that briefing, the operation had turned into a rout by 2 to 3 divisions of North Vietnamese infantry backed by tanks. Scores of U.S. Army helicopters were being blown out of the sky while trying to receive as many South Vietnamese soldiers as possible. Half the 15,000-man South Vietnamese force was killed or captured. That morning, I also noted we had lost 2 Air Force F-4 fighter planes just hours before. The 2-man crews in each plane almost certainly killed or captured. Solemnity settled over the room. A large operation essential to President Richard Nixon's Vietnamization policy was crumbling. The Lieutenant General shared his take. From what I understood, from my level, the whole goal of the South Vietnamese in Lam Son 719 was to penetrate Laos out to the town of Saipan, which they did. They got out there and they bragged about it, and then they left. Of course, the NVA assisted in their departure. This is the Lieutenant General's take on the situation. I quote, "Gentlemen, this does not look good. It also doesn't really matter." He paused. How this war in Vietnam turns out is not important. What really matters is how the Air Force looks after the war in relation to the Army and the Navy. At the time, that shocked young Lieutenant Tilford. Continuing with Dr. Tilford's piece. It was a stunning statement. I had just given a briefing noting that 4 men, 2 pilots and their 2 back-seater navigators, had been lost. But what really mattered was the future of the Air Force's budget. The Air Force and the Navy raised their admission standards for officers and enlisted men during the Vietnam War due to a surge in college-educated volunteers dodging the draft. The Army, and for a brief period the Marines, lowered their standards. The cascading effect of the draft also affected higher education, especially graduate schools. Both had expanded greatly to accommodate the baby boom generation. In 1968, the Selective Service rescinded many graduate deferments in the social sciences. To retain newly hired faculty, graduate programs lowered standards. For instance, a master's degree in history had formerly required one foreign language, with the doctorate demanding two. Language requirements for the MA were dropped and reduced to one for the Ph.D. Much of what happened in higher education over the past 50 years can be explained by the cascading effects of the draft. I write this not because I'm on the endangered species list as a mid-septuagenarian trying to ready my soul for eternity. Christ took care of that. I write because serving my tour also shaped my life. While I stayed in the Air Force, I was loaded with cynicism. By 1975, I was in Washington on a team writing the official history of U.S. Air Force operations in Vietnam. I used that opportunity to get a Ph.D. in history at George Washington University. Simultaneously, I published 3 books critical of the air war. While I used the system, I also exercised my responsibility as a citizen by serving in the military. I also studied the how and why to teach future generations. At 75, I can say all things do work together for the good of those who are called accordingly to His will. Amen to that, Dr. Earl Tilford. That is so true. For your convenience, the 3 books written by Vietnam veteran Dr. Earl Tilford will be listed on the show notes for this podcast episode over at the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. Look for episode 1825, and there you will see the 3 books written by Dr. Tilford. I encourage you to get a copy of each one of them, because I guarantee you they'll be worth reading. Dr. Earl Tilford, thank you very much for your service to your country, not only in Vietnam, but afterwards. You have gone a long way into verifying the fact that the Vietnam veteran generation is as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from its country. You served your country in a difficult situation over in Southeast Asia. When you came home, you continued serving. You're serving to this very day just by submitting this editorial piece to the Citizen over there in Fayetteville, Georgia. We thank you very much for it. And I am hereby issuing you an official Vietnam Veteran News podcast salute for your service to your country. Thank you very much. We wish you the best, and we hope you get off that COVID-19 endangered species list very soon. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1825 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?